All right, so have you ever thought about like all the stuff that goes into making something as simple as a custom notebook? You know, the kind with fancy paper, a personalized cover, really making it your own?
I mean, there's a whole world behind the scenes, right?
Yeah. And today we're going deep on how global trade policies, stuff like tariffs, can actually make that dream notebook cost way more than you might expect.
Definitely. Tariffs can have a huge impact, especially on industries that rely heavily on imports, and paper products are a great example of that.
So for this deep dive, we're tapping into some serious insider knowledge. We've got insights from the CEO of Lion Paper, a company that actually makes these custom notebooks.
It's fascinating to see how they've dealt with these challenges. I mean, they're right in the thick of it.
Yeah, it's not just theory with them. Okay, so first things first. Tariffs, what are they again? Basically, they're like taxes on imported goods.
Right. And our CEO source actually uses this analogy of businesses being like sailors navigating rough waters, and tariffs are like these sudden storms that pop up.
I love that analogy. It really captures that feeling of uncertainty in the global market.
And the source material specifically talks about how tariffs on imports from China, Mexico, Canada have created some real problems for companies making paper products.
So, how does this affect you, the listener? Well, those tariffs can make the raw materials more expensive, which means the final product, that custom notebook, also becomes more expensive.
It puts businesses in a tough spot. The source talks about this example of like a stationary retailer that specializes in these bespoke custom products. They have to decide, do they eat the extra cost from the tariffs and lose profit? Yeah. Or do they raise prices and potentially lose customers?
It's a real dilemma, and I love that we have Lion Paper's perspective because they've lived through this.
Yeah, they've got some great insights into how businesses can roll with the punches,
Hmm.
so to speak.
So let's get into their strategies. First up, diversification. They had a facility in China, but they also opened one in Cambodia.
Smart move.
And according to JTM Asia, Cambodia has some of the most competitive labor costs in the region.
That can really help keep prices stable.
For sure. They also really leaned into trade agreements.
Now, those might sound kind of boring, but they can be huge.
Right. Trade agreements basically set the rules for trading between countries, and a lot of times they include reduced tariffs or no tariffs on certain products.
It can be a real game changer.
Like Cambodia has this deal with the European Union called Everything But Arms.
Catchy name?
It basically means they can export almost anything to Europe without paying tariffs. Talk about a competitive edge.
It shows you how knowing the ins and outs of these agreements can give businesses a serious advantage.
Absolutely. And then there's the sustainability angle. Lion Paper is really big on using eco-friendly materials in production, which is great for the planet, of course.
But it can actually be good for business, too. Sustainable practices often come with tax breaks, and sometimes they can even help you avoid tariffs related to environmental rules.
So win-win. And last but not least, they made sure their supply chain was flexible. Didn't rely on just one supplier for anything.
Always good to have a backup plan or, several backup plans. Yeah.
Exactly, like having a plan B, C, and D. It's like when that tariff on a key material from China hit, boom, they were ready. Because they had other suppliers lined up, they didn't miss a beat.
It shows how important it is to plan ahead and build that resilience into your business.
Absolutely. Being prepared is key.
Yeah, like a good sailor, always watching out for those storms.
Exactly. Okay, so we've seen how Lion Paper dealt with those tariff headaches, but what about the bigger picture? How is all this affecting the whole paper and packaging industry?
It's important to think about those ripple effects. When one country throws up some tariffs, others often retaliate, and it can turn into a whole trade war.
So it's not just one country making a move, there are consequences that can impact everyone.
Exactly. The source material actually talks about how Canada hit back with its own tariffs on stuff the U.S. makes like paper and plastic packaging.
Makes sense.
And that can really throw a wrench in things for manufacturers in the U.S., just makes everything more complicated.
For sure. So, okay, let's look at the impact on businesses in this industry. What kind of difficult choices are they facing?
Well, one option is to just raise prices to
Right.
make up for the higher cost of materials because of the tariffs. But that's kind of risky, right?
Yeah, could make them less competitive.
For sure. I mean, consumers are going to shop around if prices get too high.
Makes sense.
So another option is to try and find different sources for their materials. But that could be a huge hassle and expensive.
Yeah, like starting from scratch almost.
Pretty much. It
Yeah.
means taking another look at their whole supply chain and maybe finding new partners, which takes time.
So, no easy answers there. Sounds like a real logistical nightmare.
Yeah. And there's actually research on this. The source mentions a study by North Carolina State University that shows how tariffs can really hurt business, especially if they're in a competitive market.
So this isn't just like one company's experience, the data backs it up.
Exactly. And I think it shows just how connected the global economy is. When trade policies change in one place, it can have effects everywhere.
It's all connected. Okay, so this might seem pretty far removed from everyday life, if you're not in global trade or whatever, but how does this affect the average person?
Well, think back to that custom notebook we talked about.
The one that might be more expensive now.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example of how these trade policies can directly affect what we buy. And it's not just notebooks. Think furniture, clothes, electronics, anything that uses imported materials.
So tariffs aren't just some abstract thing, they hit us in the wallet.
That's right. And it's not even just about price. Tariffs can also affect how much stuff is available. If things get more expensive or harder to import, we might see less selection in stores or have to wait longer to get what we ordered.
So it's like a domino effect. Okay, I get it. But it seems like we've been talking about how businesses are dealing with all this. Do consumers have a role to play?
That's a great question. Our source is mostly focused on the business side, but it did bring up a really interesting point. Like, what if we could actually do something to influence these policies instead of just reacting to them?
Yeah, we've been talking about weathering the storm, but what if we could, control the weather?
Exactly. What if businesses and consumers work together to support policies that are good for everybody? Policies that support sustainable practices, get rid of unnecessary obstacles to trade, and create a more stable market.
I love that idea. It can feel like we don't have a lot of control when it comes to big economic stuff, but if we start talking about what we want these policies to look like, maybe we can actually change things.
Right. It's not just about surviving the storm. It's about working together to make the whole system better.
I'm into that. So we've seen how tariffs can really shake things up for businesses, how Lion Paper managed to adapt, and how those effects are being felt throughout the whole paper industry. And we even talked about how it trickles down to us, the consumers. But before we wrap up this deep dive, you had a really thought-provoking question for our listeners.
Yeah, throughout this conversation, we've mostly been talking about how businesses are adapting to these trade policies, right?
Huh.
Which makes sense. I mean, they have to work within the system as it is. But what if we also thought about how we could actually influence those policies? Not just react, but actually shape them.
Yeah, what if we could actually have some control over those trade winds?
Exactly. It's about being proactive. Could businesses actually advocate for policies that are good for them and for consumers?
I like that idea.
Policies that encourage sustainability, get rid of unnecessary barriers to trade, and help create a market that's more stable and fair.
It's easy to feel like we don't have a say when it comes to this big global stuff, but maybe if businesses and consumers work together to support smarter policies, we could actually make a difference.
Absolutely. It's not just about riding out the storm. It's about working together to chart a better course.
I like that analogy. So to our listeners out there, the next time you're using a notebook, or really any product, think about everything that went into it, all the materials, the manufacturing, the policies that shaped how it got to you.
It really is a whole interconnected world.
Yeah, and understanding it a bit better can make you a more informed consumer, a more strategic thinker, and hey, maybe even inspire you to get involved in shaping those policies in a positive way.
It's all about that deeper understanding. It can empower us to actually take action, advocate for change, and contribute to a better future for everybody.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep diving deeper into those things that make you curious. You never know what you'll find.